You've probably seen these movies in history class, on Oscar night, or on every best costume list ever made. But how many are actually telling the truth? Today, I'm going through some of the most popular period piece movies, like Elizabeth, The King's Speech, and Gladiator, and showing you exactly why historians can't stand them. In many ways, Elizabeth encapsulates what people love about historical films: dramatic situations, beautiful but unwieldy dresses, poison, and people making grand statements in beautiful interiors. Unfortunately, many of these situations are dressed up for the film, and even some of the poison is fake. Elizabeth shows the dangerous period immediately surrounding the young queen's accession to the throne, political and religious machinations endangering her at every turn. One of her most powerful rivals is the grand and terrifying Marie de Guise, the French Queen of Scotland. She governed it in the name of her not-yet-grown daughter, the luckless Mary, Queen of Scots. The movie has her being poisoned by Elizabeth's advisor Walsingham, but in the real world, she simply died of illness. Many of the other issues in the film are due to compression of time or simple dramatic license. For example, William Cecil served Elizabeth faithfully for decades. She didn't shoo him out the door once she got her throne under her. The film's flamboyant, cross-dressing Duke of Anjou was a possible husband for Elizabeth when she was pretending to be considering marriage. But this courtship occurred much later. It was his brother Henry III who many historians believe was gay. Elizabeth's famous white-faced aesthetic is brought forward in time as well. Her complexion-wrecking bout of smallpox didn't strike her until she'd been queen for several years. The sequel to Elizabeth returned with more dresses, more intrigue, and more inaccuracies. Like many historical dramas, it compresses time to make its story more coherent and more suitable for a contained film. But it also simply makes some stuff up. Many of the inaccuracies center on the person and political schemings of Elizabeth's cousin and rival, Mary, Queen of Scots. Mary did spend the last period of her life in Elizabeth's custody in England. As a potential heir to the English throne, Mary was too dangerous to be allowed to wander around freely. But the character's situation in the film doesn't match that of her historical inspiration. Mary grew up in France and therefore spoke with a French accent. Actress Samantha Morton's lovely Scottish diction is charming but highly improbable. The real Mary would have been under tighter guard than depicted in the film. And it also sanitizes her execution. The executioner needed more than one strike and didn't account for her wig afterward. That caused him to drop her severed head on the floor. The great battle against the Spanish Armada is also altered from the historical record. While it was an English victory, the English fleet was both much stronger than the film shows and aided by a storm that scattered the Spanish fleet. And the little Spanish princess that the film's King Philip II was plotting to put on England's throne was actually an adult woman in 1588. Based on a play, 1964's Becket centers on the tension between England's King Henry II and the Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Becket. Unfortunately, by focusing so tightly on those two figures, the movie does a disservice to the two most important women in Henry's life. Henry's mother, Empress Matilda, and wife Eleanor of Aquitaine were actually two of the most fascinating and powerful women of the High Middle Ages. But you wouldn't know it from Becket. Henry would never have become king if not for his mother. The heir to her father, King Henry I, Matilda was the widow of the Holy Roman Emperor when she began a civil war against her cousin to claim her inheritance in England and Normandy. Personally courageous and a competent strategist, she almost won the war. However, her crisp personality alienated the population of London. At one point, she released her rival, Stephen, after capturing him. When Stephen's heir died, an agreement between the two sides allowed her son Henry to be the next king. Eleanor was the fabulously wealthy, famously beautiful Queen of France when she divorced her husband to marry Henry II. She had already been on crusade in the Holy Land, and she brought the English crown the Duchy of Aquitaine, a huge chunk of southwestern France. Over the course of her turbulent marriage, she rebelled against Henry in alliance with their sons, spent years in captivity, and ultimately outlived Henry to help her sons govern their sprawling domains. Most people don't like talking about Nazis, but if you're making a movie about the lead up to World War II, you have to. The King's Speech takes a few liberties with timelines in the interest of making a demanding process of speech therapy compelling, which is fair. But it also sanitizes the unsavory Nazi sympathies of the movie's indirect villain, the selfish and fascist King Edward VIII. Edward is usually remembered for abdicating the thrones of the United Kingdom and the other Commonwealth realms. He did it to marry Wallis Simpson, a divorced American from Baltimore. What history sometimes forgets, and the movie largely ignores, is that Edward and Wallis were effectively Nazis. They were friendly enough with the fascist powers to ask them to have the German occupation troops look after their house in France after the invasion. The British government made Edward governor of the Bahamas during the war. This sounds like a treat if you don't factor in the fact that they wanted him far away from Europe, just in case he felt like trying to ride a German invasion of England back to the throne. His sour legacy does not deserve the kid-glove treatment the King's Speech provides. The opening sequence here is one of the best in a movie musical. A ruined old theater is suddenly revived, dust flying away, colors regaining their vibrancy as the famous theme from the show begins. And then they ruin it all with the caption Paris 1870. France was in the middle of losing the Franco-Prussian War for much of 1870. That year was one of the very few in recent-ish history during which being in Paris would have been profoundly unpleasant. The ill-fated Emperor Napoleon III was captured at the Battle of Sedan on September 1st, and by September 19th, Paris was under siege. The siege lasted until January, and conditions within the city became so grave that horses, rats, dogs, cats, and even the animals in the zoo were consumed. A famous restaurant Christmas menu offered camel, kangaroo, and a variety of wines. It was, after all, still Paris. The following year saw little improvement. After the siege ended and the Germans went home, the Parisians were so furious that they rebelled against the central government. France had to invade its own capital. Catherine Parr, in life and in death, deserves more than she's gotten. Henry VIII's last wife was just one of the two out of the famous 6 wives to survive the king. Catherine was among the first women to publish a book in English under her own name. She was a kind stepmother, devoted religious reformer, and astute political player within the limits available to her. And what's interesting and quite unusual, she also had a happy ending, marrying for love after Henry's death. Sadly, she died in childbirth not long after. But despite all this, Firebrand doesn't really tell Catherine's story. Instead, the film fabricates a relationship between her and female preacher Anne Askew. Askew was herself deeply cool, sassing her torturers in the Tower of London before her execution for heresy. But there's no evidence she and Catherine knew one another well or even at all. Catherine is also imprisoned for heresy in the film. In real life, she was investigated but never arrested. She was never pregnant by the king, and she almost definitely did not murder Henry VIII. A reigning monarch rendered incapable of rule by mental illness is a fascinating film topic. The madness of King George can be forgiven for massaging the political ramifications of its subject's illness. There probably are people who would like to watch a movie about Parliament, but probably not enough to fill theaters. Its treatment of the titular disease, however, has some more explaining to do. The film takes for granted the popular but unproven theory that George's illness came from a genetic disease called porphyria. This covers a range of related disorders caused by faulty synthesis of a crucial oxygen-carrying molecule in the blood. Porphyria can cause psychiatric symptoms, but it is much more of a physical disease. This is at odds with the film's focus on the behavioral treatment that the king receives. Further analysis of historical evidence, such as George's letters, has led some historians and medical experts to believe that bipolar disorder was more likely than porphyria. Finally, the film doesn't address the most tragic part of George's illness. It focuses on his first serious spell of mental illness from 1788. He actually recovered, and the movie neglected to mention the depressing but relevant fact of his second episode. In 1811, George again fell seriously ill. He spent 9 final years incapable of governing until his death in 1820. Putting Keira Knightley in elaborate period costumes and letting her enjoy herself is a recipe for a fun movie. But you won't necessarily get an accurate one. The Duchess, in which Knightley stars as the glamorous and influential Duchess of Devonshire, shears away some of the complexities of the actual Duchess. It actually leaves the film without some of its main characters' most interesting traits. The real-world Duchess of Devonshire, Georgina Cavendish, was an interesting and complicated woman. She was one of the foremost trendsetters of her day, with a wide range of interests that included government, mineralogy, and fashion. Friendly, social, and what passed for progressive among the British upper classes at the time, she involved herself in politics. She even campaigned for the reform-minded Whig Party in parliamentary elections. She was also a compulsive gambler and emotionally intense to the point of writing letters in her own blood. I just hope they were brief. The Duchess smooths out the Duchess. Her gambling, drinking, and compulsive spending are limited in the film, as is her role as a fashion influencer. She wears some great costumes, but they're not clearly connected to her own instinct to set trends. The Duchess's political activities are also soft-pedaled. They show it as something of a phase instead of one of the great interests and projects of her life. Georgina Cavendish was friends with Marie Antoinette and a published author too, but a movie featuring the fullness of her life, sadly, is yet to be made. Most of the inaccuracies in historical films, however severe, fall short of being genuinely offensive. This isn't so for The Imitation Game, a biopic about the life of codebreaker and mathematician Alan Turing. This movie actually accuses its central figure of wartime treachery. The real Alan Turing worked on wartime code-breaking during World War II, making such Allied successes as the Normandy invasion possible. He also created the famous Turing test. A computer or language model passes the Turing test if a user thinks they are communicating with a human being rather than a computer. Turing was also gay, and an ungrateful British government prosecuted him for it. Forced to take female hormones to kill his sex drive, Turing took his own life in 1952. A key point here is that queer people were not, in Turing's day, allowed to work in sensitive government departments because they were felt to be untrustworthy. The film takes this untrustworthiness as a given. There's even a Soviet spy in Turing's code-breaking unit blackmailing him over his homosexuality. The spy is based on a real person, but he did not work closely with Turing in real life. Instead of focusing on the extraordinary legacy of Turing, The Imitation Game heavily implies a homophobic trope, that a gay person would apparently betray their country to conceal it. The 1963 historical epic Cleopatra was made largely as an excuse to dress Elizabeth Taylor up as an Egyptian queen. There's so much eyeshadow and such heavily ornamented hair, she deserved an Oscar for remaining upright. Nevertheless, for a mid-20th century film at least, it's relatively faithful to the known history, aside from Egypt being full of white people. But there's one notable exception: how it portrays the pivotal naval battle of Actium. Actium was the last big battle of the war between Octavian, who would shortly be rebranded as Caesar, and his rival Mark Antony, backed by Cleopatra's Egypt. Mark Antony and Cleopatra lost the battle, Egypt and their lives, in fairly short order. The Battle of Actium is one of the major set pieces of Cleopatra, portrayed at great cost and with little realism. For example, if a battleship is about to ram the side of your boat, chucking a javelin at it won't really do much, and fighting with your sword on a boarded ship without your shield was just unheard of. Gladiator is a widely acclaimed movie that follows the story of the Roman general Maximus. The lead character is betrayed by the treacherous son of the emperor and forced to fight as an anonymous gladiator to get close enough for his revenge. It evokes the Roman Empire extremely well, even if it is a film notorious for the magical pillow that appears under Russell Crowe's head during his death scene. But as good-looking and dramatic as Gladiator is, a closer examination of its historical accuracy finds it to be wanting. From the clothes worn by the German barbarians in the film's opening battle to the extreme unlikelihood that Emperor Marcus Aurelius would, or could, convey imperial power to a general as depicted, the movie gets a lot of stuff wrong. For example, in the film, the emperor doesn't like or trust his son Commodus, who then murders his father in order to seize the throne. But in reality, Aurelius named Commodus co-emperor 14 years before his death, and Commodus took power peacefully. Most egregiously, of course, the film shows Emperor Commodus dying at the hands of Russell Crowe's Maximus. Commodus was widely disliked, and he was assassinated in his bath after ruling the empire for 12 long years. It's little wonder that many of the historical accuracy consultants asked not to be listed in the credits. Here, Tom Cruise plays a former U.S. Army officer who's going through some serious PTSD and who takes a job helping to modernize Japan's military. He's seduced into supporting a doomed but noble samurai rebellion. He trains to become a samurai warrior even as the way of life they represent is about to be destroyed forever. It's an excellent narrative, and it's largely based on the true story of Saigo Takamori. After helping to restore the power of the emperor, Takamori was shocked when the emperor stripped the samurai of their power and privileges. So he led a rebellion. Unfortunately, the film isn't very concerned with historical accuracy. While it's true that Japan hired Western consultants, none of them were American. The samurai were also familiar with modern weaponry and would have used firearms in their battles. Worse, the samurai cause isn't presented realistically. In reality, it was more about class. The creation of a modern professional army elevated a class of people the samurai regarded as beneath them. So the main motive here was actually to maintain their power and wealth. And of course, the film shows ninjas attacking the samurai. Ninjas are decidedly cool, but Japan hadn't seen actual ninjas in centuries by that point in history. Mel Gibson's film is pretty blatant about its intentions. You don't call a movie The Patriot if you're offering up a fair and balanced view of the American Revolution. Gibson and director Roland Emmerich consulted with the Smithsonian Institution to get the details right, so the sets and costumes are pretty spot on as a result, and the story about Gibson's South Carolina farmer who joins the rebels when his family is murdered is affecting and well done. The filmmakers were obviously worried that they didn't have a strong villain for the story, however. The portrayal of the British Army officers is outlandishly fictional. Every British person in the film is a sadist and a war criminal, in that order. The film also gets the plight of Black Americans completely wrong. The decision to make it clear that Gibson's character is not an enslaver, despite living in South Carolina, is forgivable. But Black people are presented as freely fighting alongside their white neighbors in the Continental Army. While there was some discussion of raising Black units during the war, this never actually happened. There's also the fact that most of the Black people in the southern colonies at the time were enslaved. This is something the film simply ignores. Roland Emmerich is a director known for two things: big, splashy, special effects-driven movies, and wild historical, scientific, and general inaccuracy. And this movie may be Emmerich's greatest achievement in terms of the latter. The film's list of lavish historical errors include depicting people building the pyramids in Egypt, the use of steel, and enormous, thriving cities. Most of the trappings of civilization the film shows, monuments, writing, and farming, were either just getting off the ground or wouldn't show up for thousands of years. That's not to say that 10,000 BC was the dullest period in human history. Far from it, in fact. Our species was transitioning from the Paleolithic to the Neolithic period, when we began to adopt a more settled lifestyle. This Mesolithic period saw some of the earliest attempts at agriculture, permanent settlements, organized religion, and some seriously impressive stone tools. But we weren't building pyramids with woolly mammoths. If all your knowledge about Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart comes from the excellent, multiple Oscar-winning 1984 film Amadeus, you may think you know three basic facts. Mozart was a musical genius? True. Mozart loved a good fart joke? Also true. And that Antonio Salieri hated Mozart, conducted a cruel gaslighting campaign to drive him insane, and probably indirectly caused his death. This is almost certainly not true in any way. Amadeus tosses facts out the window in favor of drama. The film gets credit for accurately portraying some of Mozart's more childish and fart-loving personality traits. But the whole Salieri-hated Mozart business was fiction, drummed up by Russian writer Alexander Pushkin after both were dead. The film explicitly makes many of Mozart's later works seem like failures when in fact they were uniformly successful. And the whole business with Salieri dressing up like his dead father to commission the Requiem actually happened in a completely different Salieri-free way. Peter Schaffer, who wrote the play the film was based on, was upfront about the lack of facts in this historical story. He said, obviously, Amadeus on stage was never intended to be a documentary biography of the composer, and the film was even less of one.